Hi, and welcome to this discussion on Mindset 7 from Cultures and Thinking in Action by Dr. Ron Ritchhart. The title of our discussion today, or the title of this chapter, is Learning Occurs at the Point of Challenge. I'm joined by my colleagues Judy Higgins and Lori Colpoys, and we're going to be uh, looking at quotes and questions for reflection uh, that span pages 151 to 171 in Cultures of Thinking in Action. We'd recommend that you take a look at that if you do have a copy of the book. And as you're taking a look at that chapter, capture your thinking by recording connections with your experience, authors' ideas that you'd challenge, concepts you think are worth considering, and changes that you think the author is suggesting. On our website at noadam.com, you can get a copy of this recording as well as reflection questions and the PowerPoint to share if you'd like to repeat this discussion with a team back at your school or in your district. So jumping right in here, the first quote that we chose to highlight from page 151 and 160, the questions from 160, is the pressure for mastery of academic skills sometimes pushes teachers to focus on transferring information quickly rather than allowing students time to grapple with ideas, sort through ambiguities, and deal with complexities. Too often, teachers tend to reduce the challenge of tasks with the goal of making work more manageable for students. And the questions that we raised here was really around what beliefs about struggle, challenge, and failure are common in our school, in our community, in our classroom, and to what degree are they positive or negative? And I think we asked this question because beliefs are in a way predictive or leading. And so I want to kind of open that up to everyone, Lori, Judy, in terms of your thoughts on this quote and the connection to beliefs in schools. And
I would love to start with this one because I did a teacher training where we talked about exactly this mindset. And it was really interesting because I had both teachers and administrators in the discussion, which was so powerful because teachers talked about wanting to do this. They understood the importance of struggle, but they talked about some of the pushback they got from parents. And we had such a great discussion about how struggle needs to be redefined, that struggle doesn't mean your kid is in trouble, your kid is failing. Your child is struggling because they're working hard. And so we had a wonderful conversation about how to educate parents, but teachers were also, which I really appreciated, they really talked to directly to their administrators about, we don't want to receive the phone calls. How can you help us educate the parents on when your child comes home and talks about, oh, things were really hard. I really struggled. I didn't know the answers. Can you help us? Can you take some of those phone calls? Can you be proactive around getting ahead of this? Let's talk to parents at the beginning of a school year. We actually talked about, we had a whole group conversation about doing something at the beginning of a school year to educate parents. And we all were very vulnerable. I talked about if I got a phone call saying one of my kids was struggling, I would go right to panic mode in terms of, what is going on? What's wrong? What's happening? And I'd be so scared. So I think that that's a very struggling, they're challenged, and then, well, failure is a huge one. What does that mean? So thinking about how do we talk about this in in ways that aren't scary, but we're going to celebrate challenge and struggle and take a look at what actually is failure.
mm,
It's interesting. I think all the trainings I go to, I often hear time, 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 time. And I think on the outside, sort of up in their head, teachers understand this notion. But I think when it comes to the nitty gritty and the day to day, it's hard to hang on to this notion and slow down. I think, there's a certain amount of irony here with the concept of time, um, transferring information quickly rather than engaging them in inquiry and productive struggle and reducing the challenge to make things more manageable is, of course, also reducing the opportunity for long-term deeper learning. And that pressure to cover, which we hear all the time, Judy, right? When we're in our training, that pressure to cover, we can't get through all the units, it's too much.
Yeah.
That pressure to cover is actually resulting in less coverage. So it's
Mm,
kind of this, and I think teachers get that, but I think when they're in it in the day to day, that they can get fooled easily with transformational teaching. How often do we hear a teacher's frustration with, well, they knew it that day, but then the next day it's like they've never heard
mm,
it before. Um, and the book mentions this distinction between learning, which is long lasting, and performance, which is in the immediate, that's sort of short term functioning.
mhm.
Um, and of course, if your instruction is focusing on performance, you're kind of getting that illusion that they're learning, but then those gains are soon lost. So it's just interesting. In the interest of saving time, it's actually wasting time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the visual that I get is, and we've all done this at one time or another. It's taking it's and the book talks about this, that there's different ways of scaffolding. There's the making it easier scaffold, and
Yep.
then there's the engaging students and reflecting on strategy and reflecting to actually grapple differently in a sense, as opposed to removing what is being grappled with. And the thing that I think about that I know I've done, we've probably all done it at some point, is approaching approaching a learning opportunity as a task to get a product out.
Hmm.
And to make that work palpable or doable by students by breaking that task down into these very discrete little steps. And you can, in the context of science, I mean, you can picture it. Let's just picture building a car. We can challenge students to move a load a certain distance, and they can have access to materials, and they can make choices about how to do that, and they can grapple with those choices. Or we can build a car, we can hold it up, we can show them that we need four wheels and where they go and glue it on like this. And okay, now do that and wait for me. And then we can move on to the next step, and we can go through that lock step. And when I think about that, it reflects a belief. I would say, because I think about it like, why would I do that? And and I think it reflects a belief that what's important is the kids all get cars that act and behave and look a certain way.
And it's
That's,
a focus on the task too,
it's a
Francis,
focus on the
right?
task. And that
Not the
by,
understanding behind it. You kind of have to start with like an understanding map. What do I want my kids to understand at the end? Not what's the task they have to finish.
well, and I think that, I'm not sure because I'm not the author here, but like, I wonder if the author would say, we have to really focus on the thinking we want students to engage in and the learning that we want them to engage in. Like, what is the shift? Like you're saying, understanding. Like, what is the understanding we want to build, and what's the thinking that's a part of that? Because if I just take that task and I break it down into all these little tiny discrete steps, the other thing is, again, in the chapter here, it's not one of our quotes today, but talks about how, and but you brought this up a moment ago, Lori, that these you can get short-term retention out of these sort of discrete practices, right? Like, how many wheels did the car have? Four, But in terms of long-term learning and learning for the long term, or understanding of how that works and why it's there and so on, that's lost. And so it's like I think about this question, and I think if I believe that if I believe that time is what's most important, or I believe that the product being the right product is most important. And I approach that by removing the challenges that take time and the grappling that requires thinking. I'm going to make, and this is, what was in the chapter, is that I'm going to make the retrieval of that information really difficult. I'm going to make the learning really discrete and not connected. And the learning may remain really surfacey. And so when I think about from a state test data perspective, if people really struggle to get high levels of achievement, oftentimes you walk into those classrooms and you see this very, kind of discrete breakdown of like what to do and what to know and so on and so forth. And so it's in my mind highly correlated, and I know that when I've approached things that way, I didn't get the best outcomes. And so I feel like it's my beliefs. It's like my beliefs about students. It's my beliefs about what teaching is effectively, what's effective learning. And that's one of the things I did in the margin of the book as I was going along reading this, is I feel like there are these words like teaching and learning and performance that I don't think that there's a lot of I think that there are very different ideas of what those things are among teachers and among schools. And I think that that kind of speaks to like how we might all be teachers, but we might all really believe very different things. Um, so I don't know, I just felt like this
Well, and I feel
went there
like
for me.
it's hard for us, or me. I I would often have to remind myself, because as a teacher, I would tend to like, everybody is struggling with this. I feel bad. I don't, I have to rescue. And for me, that's what I have to pull myself back and think, is this a productive struggle here? This is a good thing. And it's not, I always have to think in terms of, my job isn't to get them to the right answer. My job is to get them to think. But that's
Mhm.
hard. That's again, for me, that was and still sometimes is a hard concept, because we go to this place of wanting to, I just want everybody to be happy. I want to feel good about everybody walked out of here knowing the right answers, even
And
though
Judy,
they know them
I'm
tomorrow.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Don't you think a part of that also is the students? And I know we'll talk about this in future slides coming up, but having the students have an understanding of the struggle
Yes.
and that it's a good thing and it's okay to
Yes.
struggle and there's fun in struggle as well.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Totally. And that's what to my point at the very beginning, is talking about, let's start the school year educating everybody around
Hmm.
this. So we're all speaking the same language now. We're not
Like,
looking, my kid is struggling, therefore, I'm a terrible teacher. Everybody's struggling, as opposed to, this is amazing. Everybody's struggling. This is really cool. Let's struggle together.
mm,
Well, and I think this touches on our next quote too, because that quote was many teachers, students, parents, and policymakers see schools as a competition to determine who can master a prescribed set of content as quickly as possible. Indeed, this view is part of the grammar of schools and is the basis for many of the practices we take for granted in our institutions. One of these practices is direct instruction. The method of instruction is predicated on the belief that efficiency in acquiring a prescribed skill assessed in the near term is the goal of learning, rejecting the fact that teachers have a wide variety of goals beyond content transmission. And the question that we had raised here is there a place and time for direct instruction? What are the pros and cons of direct instruction in and inquiry-based learning? And this, the reason I wanted to bring this up in connection to what you're saying is this idea of competition. It's a zero-sum game in a sense. It's like, is my child winning as a parent, or as a teacher? Is my class winning? Am I winning as a teacher? As a student, it's am I winning? Am my grades winning? Am I winning as a student? And that concept of of mastering prescribed set of content, it's it sort of sets it up as winning is receiving what's being transferred. And so I feel like if we buy into the belief of competition and this idea that it's just really about content transfer, then that belief, it kind of from our prior slide, is going to drive us into this place of low level practices and low level learning.
Definitely. I know with the question it says, is there a place and time for direct instruction and what would be the pros and cons? And I, you know, inquiry-based learning is so powerful. It's what every teacher wants and loves. It's with inquiry-based learning, you've got those motivated, interested, engaged learners. They're having fun. They're, getting those aha moments. You're capitalizing on their curiosity, which seems to diminish as kids get older. So, that's definitely, I think, where teachers want to go. But I think there's pros and cons to both, and I think there's a place for both. And I think there needs to be the right balance. The book talks about direct instruction being most effective when learners know very little about a domain, and when instruction is going to, highlight some expert thinking. So I think there definitely is a place for both, but I think teachers need to be very aware of when each is best. And I think for inquiry-based learning, it does require a certain amount of skill on the teacher's part, because as we've been talking, you need to monitor them carefully. You have to learn how to be a coach or a facilitator without over supporting. You need to have good questioning techniques, and it's going to be more time consuming. But I think in the end, you get so much out of inquiry-based learning. But not to say that you're never going to use direct instruction.
Yeah, I thought this was a really interesting question. And what I thought about was, I first thought about parents because I was thinking about my hope that parents could be educated and parents could use some direct instruction. Here's here's what struggle is. Here's what struggle should look like. And giving parents literally direct instruction on, how to support struggle. And then introducing that same type of learning with our students and knowing that the direct instruction piece is the very tip. And then we're going to move into that and we're going to continue on learning all about that on our own, but introducing some things so we're all talking about the same thing. And sometimes that's that's really important to start off. Laurie, you talked about this was a couple of sessions ago, and it made me think of that, where you sort of talked about what your classroom was going to look like. And do you know what I'm talking about?
My philosophy chart, how we kind of, yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. And that was the first thing I thought about is that in its own way is direct instruction. And then they're going to keep learning about that, looking at that, building on that. But you
right.
stop with that because
It's
you're
foundational. That's what they say direct instruction is. It's
totally,
foundational. Yeah,
and and so you're giving the language, you're giving the expectations, but it doesn't end there. Then we can continue to go back to referencing that. And I thought that that was such a good example because I think direct instruction sometimes gets a bad name because,
completely.
but
Hmm.
I think we don't want to
Or
let,
you'll lose teachers, Judy, if you say everything should be 100% inquiry based all the
yes,
time.
Yeah,
You're not going to teach phonics,
right.
with inquiry-based learning. So it
Totally.
does have a place in the classroom, but that's
Totally.
not to say we shouldn't strive for, you know, especially in certain subjects, math and science in particular, for an inquiry-based,
Absolutely.
foundational learning. Yeah.
But I think we've got to get that clarity so teachers don't feel. So if somebody told you, now you've got to sort of like, the kids will get it as you go through the year. Yeah, but why can't I introduce it at the
Yeah.
beginning? So we know the language. We can start, we can start the learning and understanding because your students can start asking questions. Well, wait a minute, what does that mean? Well, we never did that before. And off you go. So I think that that's really important to, again, so much of this is taking apart the, what do things mean? Francis, you talked about, like, what does teaching mean? What does learning mean? And learning how to be really transparent about what we're doing and not having teachers feel like, I can't do any direct instruction. I don't know what to do. This feels
Right,
off,
right.
but
Yeah,
not,
just being very cognizant of the place for it and when it makes sense and when it doesn't
yes,
make sense. And
yes,
not having your class be 100% direct instruction.
absolutely. But that takes some learning and understanding on the teacher part of things.
It's funny you
Definitely.
bring that up about the meaning too of the words because as you both were talking, I was just reflecting on this phrase direct instruction and what does it mean to instruct? Because it's a really I think that it's easy as a teacher to think of instruction as teaching, but if you think about the word just instruct, to be instructed to do something is to be told to do it, like in a military type sense. It's like, here's your instructions, march. Um, and so to directly instruct something is to directly direct somebody to do something. And and I think what's kind of interesting here, Lori, I'd love to get your feedback on this because when you say foundational, I hear foundational and I think of it in two different ways. I think foundational, one way of thinking about that is like foundational as being like basic, the
Hmm.
basis of things. I think another way of looking at foundational and I think it's a little bit different is the framework or in a sense the procedure or the process. And I think about it's funny you used phonics as the example, a moment ago as an example because you're right. Like you can't intuit your way to to, to the way a letter sounds. It's like somebody actually has
Right.
to actually direct you and give you the direction for how to make the sound of the letter or the letters together and so on and so forth. But that's because it's a framework. And it is foundational in the sense that that framework is foundational to the way a word sounds and so on and so forth. But it's I think it's a framework, it's a process, and I come back to thinking about something like a thinking routine, right? If we're going to use a thinking routine to
Right.
approach a concept or to approach something in discussion,
Hmm.
using direct instruction to help students understand how
The
they're
basis of it.
the basis of it,
Yeah.
how that framework is engaged in this context,
Right.
it is foundational. But
Right.
but I think what I worry about with teachers hearing foundational is that they may be like, well, that's why I need to pre-teach vocabulary. I don't, I worry a little bit around
Hmm.
that. Like I'm not saying, the phonics of how to pronounce these words or something like that.
Hmm.
But in terms of engaging students in inferring meaning about a word from its context, I think is a useful inquiry practice. Um,
Yeah, I think maybe
you
it's
know,
more about when you know very little about something, or you're trying, the book talks about illuminating expert thinking, like something that, Like I know in writing techniques, where we'd hold up a model and show a technique that they wouldn't necessarily have the intuition to say, oh, that's what that is, kind of like
Sure.
phonics.
However, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate here for a little bit.
Mm,
I feel like the line, I think there's a potential creep between direct instruction and what could be inquiry based. So
for sure.
I'm gonna
I would 100% agree with that.
yeah, because even and again, like,
Mm,
and this is where I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit. Even in the example you gave about a writing style,
hmm
like let's say that we had two pieces of writing, maybe from the same author. One was persuasive and one was something else. We could ask students through questioning in that inquiry sort of model about what they notice is different, how they feel that the author is trying to interact with the audience in one piece versus another. And so while they might not come up with obviously the term persuasive writing or something like that, you have to directly instruct like that's what this is. On the flip side, there's a lot of inquiry that could go into unpacking the differences and what that is in the relationships, and maybe even why an author would choose to write a persuasive piece, in this context versus a different piece in this other context. And so that's where I feel
Absolutely.
like, that's where I feel like that it's tricky because like I
And I
feel like
think they
it's
blend. I think they blend sometimes too. I mean, teachers are tasked with teaching what a simile is, there's going to be a state assessment where so there's definitely that blend. If a student doesn't know the word simile, they might be able
right.
to find it and remark on it, but they don't know the name of it, so there's definitely a blend for sure.
And so I guess that for me, like, what are the pros and cons? I think the pros of direct instruction is when a framework is involved, direct instruction can help students understand the framework, like what it is, how to make the noise of the letter, and so on. But the inquiry is really how you put that framework to work in a setting that's meaningful. And I think the chapter talks about this, or prior chapters talk about this, identifying the thinking and the learning. We have to be careful that we don't view the perceived efficiency of direct instruction as being like letting it take the place of the understanding that inquiry can give us. Does that make
I
sense?
would, yeah, and I would say if you're in a classroom where direct instruction is the norm, you're going to see students that are over dependent.
Mhm.
They're going to have less autonomy. They're not going to be those well-rounded students that have problem-solving skills and can monitor their own learning. That's the real downside of too much direct instruction. And it's not going to hit every student either.
Mhm.
Um, and the students are going to be passive. And I think in a direct instruction class, you're going to see teachers getting fooled that students are understanding. Where, that's the thing about direct instruction. You're not tapping into their thinking. So how do you know what
Right.
they're
Right.
learning? If
There's
they're
no,
sitting there and smiling at you, do they get it?
Right, right.
yeah, there's no questions, there's no curiosity.
hmm hmm
And we can move on to the next slide, but the I guess I think about walking into colleagues' classrooms. I think about starting as a teacher and what was in my mind as what does an effective classroom look like? And then I think about walking into classrooms and all over the place as I do. Um, in the more military-like that it feels, the less learning is going on, the more directed it is. Like I, th I think about students, the classic picture of students at desks in rows. You don't see that as much anymore, but there are sneaky little ways that that same sort of thing happens. It's all these sort of like kitschy little things about controlling students' thinking or behavior or whatever. And a lot of times it comes in under the guise of classroom management and it can produce the smiling kids that are quiet in their seat, but it's highly controlled, it's highly directed. So it's actually directed by somebody who's not the student. And I think that's the other side of this. When kids are highly directed, it's not coming from them. Just like the sound of the letter didn't come from them. They learned that from somebody else. They learned to mimic the sound. They understand its connection, and now they're using it, and they're using it to sound out words or whatever. But it's I think about students that um, it concerns me quite a bit because instruction the instructional environment can become very pneumatic and pneumatic feeling and I think that that's a very big con of having too much direct instruction is that, like you said, it takes the autonomy away. It takes it's disempowering in a lot of ways. And I think that that's, beyond engagement. You're not going to get the engagement, but you're never going to get the empowerment out of that sort of heavy focus. Um, this was our next quote here. Another driver of both teachers' reduction of challenge and students' fear of challenge is that too many of us simply do not see the benefits of learning from our mistakes. We may have internalized society's message that mistakes are failures that reflect badly on us and should be avoided. The fact is, a bit of difficulty in forcing the brain to work harder can lead to better memory and retention. Cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork coined the term desirable difficulties to describe those conditions that may be difficult and impede performance in the short term, but led to better learning in the long run. We had a few questions here that are kind of interrelated. How can how can one help students understand the relationship between productive struggle and improved learning? Do I tend to rescue students when they struggle, or do I support their initiative by asking questions that will encourage them to do the thinking? How do mistakes and failure differ?
I immediately, when I thought of these questions, I thought of actually the math program that we used. Um, and there was always a page in every lesson that this program was really capitalized on the notion of interleaving and spacing learning. So interleaving where you're kind of mixing skills, and they were called boxes, math boxes, and um, it would be a mixture of different skills that they had learned throughout the year. Um, and it would go through sort of the same cadence every year. In the beginning of the year, students, there'd be, it'd be time to work on them, and there'd be a long line, or hands would be up all over the room, and kids would be coming and constantly asking for help. And a lot of times it was, they didn't actually need the help. They were asking for it, but had they sat with it a little, they could have worked on it on their own. And inevitably, what would happen as the years went on is they would be coming to me less and less and less, and that was for a couple of reasons. Um, I would support them, but I would support them by throwing it kind of back on them, asking them questions about, but you already know about this problem. Tell me what part is hard for you. Where are you stuck? I would point out different strategies they could use, or different reference tools in the room, a word wall that would have what an acute angle is with a picture of it, or the reference folders that they had on their desk. Or the boxes were paired with other boxes. So look at the one you did, 3 days ago. And like I said, inevitably they would come to me less and less, A, because they knew I wasn't going to give them the answer, and B, they were developing coping strategies. And when I had student teachers in the room, we'd have to sit and have that hard conversation as well, where I'd have to kind of ask the student teacher, how can we help them through this struggle? Like, what's going to be the best way for them to build the skill so that she or he wasn't over supporting as well. But think about how subtly they were getting that message that they could do it on their own.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it happens in lots of subtle ways and probably not so subtle ways. I know growth mindset is something that's a very common part of many classrooms today, where you're literally direct instruction teaching them what a growth mindset is versus a fixed mindset. Um, I know we'd start the year and I would purposely give them something super challenging, super fun and engaging, but very challenging before I talked about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, so that when we did bring up the two different mindsets, they could reflect on how they were acting in that moment of struggle. Did they just want to give up? Were they the kid that was like, no, 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 don't give us the answer, don't give us the answer yet, so that they could really have a grasp of, do I have a fixed mindset or do I have a growth mindset? Um, so I think there's a lot a teacher can do subtly and very overtly and sort of covertly at the same time.
That's such a good example, Laurie. And that's so, like, for you as a teacher, that must have been so cool to see that. One of the things that I loved in the book where they talked about the teacher who would show the video about the people getting stuck on the escalator.
Oh, yes. Yep. Yep.
So I loved that so much
Yep.
because that just said so much. And, the absurdity of, because when I first read it, I was like, well, they were on an elevator. Oh, no, they weren't. They were on an escalator.
Escalator. Yeah.
And
My
that,
students actually, I would show that and they would start to say, is that a broken escalator question?
yeah,
Like, is that
well,
a question we can solve ourselves?
that is so, but it's such for we're talking about, I want to make sure people know what we're talking about. The
Mhm.
teacher shows this video of there's a couple on an escalator and the escalator stops working. And they immediately take out their cell phones and start calling for help. And it takes a minute to realize, well, wait, why don't they just walk down the thing? And it's such like a great, like both subtly
Kids,
in your
kids
face.
love that.
Oh,
They
yes.
crack up.
Well, and it's so funny, and I loved that she too talked about that, Lori, in her classroom of kids saying, "Get off the escalator,"
Yeah. Yeah.
as opposed to, but for me, that just resonated because I thought about my insecurity as a learner that immediately just ask for help. You don't want to spend any more time going
Hmm.
down this path, or I'm never going to get there. And trusting myself, but then moving to trust my students a little bit and don't, you know, ask them a question as opposed to giving them the answer. And so I thought that was such a powerful thing. And that's funny, Lori, that you actually showed that video because I had
Hmm.
seen it before. And I loved the thought of it. I loved the video. I loved everything about it. And again, you're giving so much information without direct instruction. What do we think about this? And for your students to adopt that. And then also for you as a teacher to see what's happening here. Why is this happening? How can we continue to do this to get them to, stop, breathe? I think a lot of the same thing happened in my classroom with when I started using checkpoints.
I
And
was just gonna say, yep.
yeah, like everybody, checkpoints were when we would stop and students were responsible for coming, talking about where they were, showing, giving us the opportunity to formatively assess. Do you really understand? Does everybody in the group understand where you're going before they could move on to the next step? Because everybody wanted to get to the final step of when can I start, building what I want to build? When can I get my hands on the materials? Well, there are steps that we have to go through. And at the beginning, everybody was turned back. And then they started to learn, oh, we got to make sure everybody understands before we go and check in.
It's just like the math boxes. You could say about a hypothesis, well, tell me what you know about a hypothesis,
Yeah,
and sure enough, they would be able to tell you okay, so well, how is this hypothesis starting? Is that how we start a hypothesis, or, whatever it was, same thing as the math boxes, it's that
Absolutely.
those
Absolutely.
questions leading them to their own understanding because they have it. They just haven't reflected on it enough.
Mhm.
Right, right. And I think for me, the magic, and we talk about this a lot with teachers, is, my thinking at the beginning, I can't do all of that. My classroom will lose control if I'm focusing on one group. What's happening with the other groups? And that fear of I don't have the time, you talked about that at the beginning, was time is always an issue. And my realization that, yeah, it was super messy at first, but the time was so worthwhile once everybody realized this is a routine, these are the expectations. And then suddenly everything got so much easier because it all took so much time, too much
Mhm.
less time when the students came to me prepared. It was like, oh, yep, within minutes, I could ask a couple of questions. Great, you guys are ready to move on. So I think that's the importance of investing the time, and then suddenly you do get that time back.
Mhm.
It's a great way to say it, investment. It is an investment and it pays off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about my students too in the subtle ways of like at checkpoints. I think checkpoints is a great example where my students would
Mhm.
come up, and I love that example of the hypothesis because they'd come up and they'd tell me, "Oh, this is our hypothesis," and I'd be like, "Well, can that hypothesis sounds like a question?
Mhm.
Like, what is a hypothesis?" And so I would engage them in reflection, and even if they said, "Well, I'm not sure," then it would be like, "Well, where could we find out?" So
Mhm.
even again, putting it back on them, for me, those were the subtle ways of trying to remind them how empowered they are
Just like the
to,
math boxes. Yep.
yeah, just to
Use
a
references.
yeah, if you're struggling, I've
Yeah.
empowered you to
Right.
remove that struggle for yourself. You have the freedom to do that, and you have the resources to do that. I'm going to, if you don't, well, let's take a look. Where do we have that here? Oh, we've got an anchor chart over here. Let's take a look at that. What does that say? Um, so, like that. The other thing though is like I think about, and I don't think it comes up here exactly, but I think one of the places where I see myself, or especially early on in my teaching, is really sensitive to it, and then I see other teachers, um, in my work now that really struggle with this is the students are frustrated, the sense that they're frustrated, and so we need to like cut our losses and like we need to stop frustration. And I think that there's obviously times when you need to do that, but I think that people conflate struggle and frustration and don't always reflect on what the difference is. And
Kids
struggle
like
and
challenge.
yeah, exactly. And the research shows that.
They're
And the book
bored
actually
without
brings
it.
that up. Yeah,
Yeah. I
exactly.
think the next
Desire
slide
for
talks about
challenge.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But I think that the piece of it here is that it's if students aren't if they aren't empowered, if there's whatever, if there's no way that they can get here from there because there's a secret code that I've hidden and I'm the only one that has it, that's going to be frustrating because it's just there's no path for students to get there, period. There's no way to figure that out. It's my secret code and it's, under my shoe. But but that's not, I mean, if that's what's happening in the classroom, like that's pretty far from the kind of teaching we've been talking about. Um, does it happen out
Easy is
there? Yeah,
boring.
but it's boring. Exactly. The
Yeah.
thing is it's the pursuit for the right answer. And so like, where is it hidden? Is it hidden
Mhm.
under here? Is it hidden under there? I don't know. Go find it. That is not a desirable challenge, or a desirable difficulty. It's just
It's
grunt work.
And it's no fun getting the right answer or getting the solution when it's been easy, but there's a ton of fun in solving something that's been hard. So, and we've all experienced that as adults as well, right? So the payoff is big.
Yeah, exactly. And I think about um, this question of how do mistakes and failure differ is that that type of real black and white, there's the one answer type environment, I think makes this situation much worse because people talk about, I'll never forget. I met the guy that invented analog to digital conversion, which,
Mm.
if you've ever had an MRI or a CAT scan or benefited from a fetal heart monitor, these are all technologies that use analog to digital conversion. And he got up one day, speaking at an event, and he said, somebody asked him, uh, tell me about a time you failed. The guy was about 90, and he got up and and he said, I don't like failure. He said, I think to fear failure, there can be a healthy fear of failure. He's like, you don't graduate from the air, and this was his little words, you don't graduate from the Air Force Academy and they put you in a $400 million jet and say, go fail. You should have seen like the room just like, because everybody had, really like, the around that time the book Fail Forward had, come out. And I think what was what he kind of recovered on a little bit later on in this discussion, and I think people kind of understood what he meant a little differently, is that he said, it's important to make mistakes and to learn from, more important to learn from the mistakes, and that failure is final. Failure is giving up. Failure is catastrophic in nature. And I think and I don't even know totally what I think of what he said in its entirety. I probably haven't reflected enough on it. But I think that there's something about the difference between mistakes and failures that's a little bit lost in the teaching space, and might be just in society in general. I think that I think all too often view mistakes as failures, and I think that mistakes all too often become points of disconnection, and so they become failures because they become points of giving up. I mean, imagine a teacher, just think about a teacher who's trying to transition from tra a very traditional model of instruction where it's highly focused on directed instruction and a transfer model of knowledge, like just, you know, making a shift to inquiry-based learning where they're releasing responsibility and kids are taking risks and it's messy. There's going to be a lot of mistakes that are naturally going to happen in that environment. A- If you the first time or the second time or the third time try to engage students or even try to use inquiry practices in your classroom, if you give up because you made a mistake, you have failed. You have, because you've failed to benefit and your students have failed to benefit. But if you approach those mistakes as learning opportunities and you continue to make mistakes and you continue to try to improve, even if improvement's elusive, those aren't failures because you're continuing in that process, and that continuing to attempt to solve
Mhm.
things and to learn from them is necessary for learning. And
Those were the best student teachers, Francis, were the resilient ones that
exactly, resilience. Yes.
could take the critiques, and look at them as critiques, not mistakes, but an opportunity to improve next time.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything you want to add on this. I was going to jump to the next slide.
Yeah, I think that's good.
I didn't want to cut anybody off. Okay. Um, the next quote we had here is, given many teachers' efforts to reduce complexity, it may come as a surprise to learn that students report they actually like and value a degree of cognitive complexity, as well as the feeling of being pushed and challenged, as long as it's accompanied with support. And our questions here: how does a teacher determine when they're over supporting? How does a teacher determine when the struggle's productive versus unproductive? Touch on that a little bit. How does a teacher plan for a lesson that challenges all students appropriately?
I think I touched on this earlier. I think one signal is the students frequently asking or getting excessive, needing excessive help, even on the most basic tasks, not attempting challenging work without immediate assistance, and lack of initiative and taking ownership. I think if that's happening in your class, I think that's maybe a signal that there's some over supporting going on. Um, that should shift as the year shifts. I think that's one thing. I don't know if anybody has any other thoughts on that.
I
Well, I
just
think
think, oh, go ahead, Judy. Go ahead.
so disengage and they're, somebody used this word before, they're bored. But I think also, I think we need to spend more time helping students tap into how does it feel when you get to come back from what you initially thought was a failure, or and how does that feel? Because I think, for instance, we had been talking about helping students think and know what kind of thinking I'm doing. And I think that students often don't take that time, and teachers don't often give that time to talk about how does that feel when you've overcome something, because that's when that desirable difficulty. I love that language of that was hard, but boy did it feel good when we solved it, or we got it, or we knew where our next steps were. So I think that, over supporting when students are bored because they're not getting that rush of, wow, this was really hard. It felt so good. So to have more of that kind of discussion about how does your brain feel right now? How does that feel to succeed?
I love
It's
that.
funny,
I love, yeah, go ahead.
I loved a quote, and it made me think of No Adam, and why I enjoyed it as a teacher is, I think how you plan a lesson for challenge. I feel like No Adam sort of did that for me. And it talked about good tasks, expose misconceptions or underdeveloped ideas, and enable discussion that unpack and correct or enhance those ideas. And it says seek out tasks that create opportunities for different solutions or viewpoints and approaches. And I thought that's, when I think of like the activities in No Adam and the fact as a teacher, I didn't have to, it was sort of done for me, and I just had to be a facilitator and a coach to those tasks. Um, but I think so. I think when you're planning for it, you know, getting a lesson that focuses where students have to unpack something, where they have to struggle a bit, they have to have where there's multiple solutions, like an engineering design project where you've got multiple avenues, multiple viewpoints. Um, it doesn't get better than that with your students when, you know, it's also can meet students sort of where they're at. Um, there's multiple entry points for it. I think that's when you can really involve them in this kind of inquiry based learning where um, they're getting really pushed and having fun while they're getting pushed.
There's a quote in here that's taught on page 157, contemplating pictures of practice, normalizing struggle. And it says, this is a quote from the teacher um, who was being interviewed. She says, I want to produce students who are able to think about achieving a particular goal and manage their mental processes, she explains. Consequently, she takes every opportunity to notice and name students' growth, struggle, problem solving strategies, initiative, and cooperation. She also makes a point to step back and be sure she highlights how the students, not the teacher, worked through those problems. So she's acting as a mirror to the students and not, and I think this is the connection for me, not doing the work for
Yeah.
them, not doing the thinking for them. And that's the over supporting, over scaffolding is is doing is is taking the stretch out of this. And because if the students aren't being stretched, what's the opportunity to learn? And one of the things connecting to the prior slide that I think connects here is one of the things I always would talk with my students about when things like I would inevitably have once or twice a year a student cry about something. They would just be like, ah, I'm like losing my mind here. It just happened to be the wrong day to be facing a challenge. And I didn't leave them sitting there with that. But one of the things that we'd always talk about is, difficult things are difficult in part because they're valuable. It's things that aren't difficult aren't that valuable. They've already been done. We've already learned them. We've already mastered them. This is difficult because we haven't figured it out yet. It's not a skill that we've built, or it's not a connection we've made. And so it's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to feel challenged. Let's, and that's where we kind of go to like, let's look at the ways we're empowered to, you know, get closer to this. Who can we tap into? And so I think that's a big part of making the struggle productive is like what this person's doing, be the mirror, recognize that this is a challenge, recognize that this is a struggle, but like to borrow some of the phrasing from Judy, but like, isn't that great? Like I feel like Judy, you're like you're always working with your students or whether they're adults or kids, and it's like struggles come up, but I feel like something that I've observed in you over and over again, which I is a quality I admire, is to be able to look at that and say, but isn't that great? Look at what's really happening here. And and I think that that's a gateway to making that struggle productive, because if you can look at that and you can say, yes, you know, I made this mistake, or I overlooked this, or I made this human error, you then as a learner, if you can recognize that, you can then recognize you're recognizing the opportunity to learn from the mistake. And I think that that kind of goes back to that failure versus mistake thing. It's like that the struggle becomes productive by recognizing it is what it is for what it is, I guess. And regardless of what level the student is struggling on. And I think that
Hmm.
that's the part of the differentiation here is that that this is all naturally differentiating, because if the right task, like you're mentioning, Lori, and no, Adam, these tasks are designed to be even like the picture thinking routine. Like any child can notice something. What they notice is up to them, and its level of connectedness will be what it is.
Hmm.
And I think that that has value. I don't know.
I think
You know what's
it's,
an interesting word is scaffolding.
Mm,
And I think it means different things to different people.
I
And
agree.
the book says, and I loved this, I wrote it down. It said, navigating the terrain between frustration, too much challenge, and boredom, too little challenge. So scaffolding, it says, means being ready with prompts, hints, or modifications that preserve the learning but make the task more accessible. And you can scaffold up and you can scaffold down too. Like you can
Mhm.
scaffold something so it's more challenging for a student as well. And Francis, I think you mentioned this earlier when they talked about two different types of hints, one that reduces the challenge and one that increases the student's ability. So focusing on getting the work done by giving partial answers. How many times have you seen a teacher, it starts with or they, it's like a fill in the blank kind of answer, or they simplify the task, they reduce the challenge.
Right.
Or it's like we talked about earlier, reminding the student of a strategy. Like when we were talking, well, where can you find that information about the hypothesis? or identifying the type of thinking that would be useful, or providing a tool or a visual that could help them in some way. So I think that word scaffolding, I think, has kind of gotten watered down over over the years and can mean different things to different people and can be
One of my
misinterpreted.
Yeah, and I this reminds me of something one of my mentors said once is that scaffolding, just like on a building, scaffolding is temporary.
Right.
It comes down. And all too many people treat scaffolding as permanent. But something that's permanent is actually a modification. So if a student is on an IEP and they have mandated modifications, it is what it is. You're modifying. But a scaffold really needs to go away. And so if you're going to use a scaffold, you better have a plan to get rid of it. And otherwise, you're just modifying. And that always stood out for me because I think
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think that scaffolding, I think it's taken on different meanings and in a way like scaffolding as a support. You know, when do the supports go away? How
Just
does that?
that phrase, so it preserves the learning. That's the key, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. And so, yeah, absolutely. And I think that connects to our next slide here. In addition to being more engaging, developing thinking, and fostering understanding, regular encounters with challenge support student autonomy, creativity, and development of a growth mindset. As students learn to overcome challenges, they come to see struggle and setbacks as a natural step in learning. Uh, how might I normalize the idea of challenge, productive struggle, and learning from failure with my learners? Is support synonymous with help, or is it something different?
I think we just covered that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we did. I think that we did. So we
I
can
think
jump.
so
Go ahead.
much what we're talking about is to the language that we use. And because in terms of, again, going back to helping students understand their own brain and helping them understand, again, going back to the escalator, help, help, help. And that is sort of I surrender. I can't do it, as opposed to helping the students. What is it that I really need here? Do I need some support? Do I need some direction? Do I need, and then figuring out how to help myself. You've given me some good ideas, even to, you know, helping students to understand that you have the ability to go talk to another student and sort of, helping us as teachers to changing that role is we're the only place to go to for help and support. And that was something that was really powerful for me as a teacher, letting go of that. I was the being. And I used to get really annoyed. It's like, why won't they stop asking me? Well, because I was modeling that I was the place to go. And letting them know that there's lots of different ways to support themselves, their group, each other is because, and I think that's such a powerful thing when I see that in a classroom, is that I see that kind of thing going on where students going over and can I take a look at that? What do you think about this? And helping them be supportive to each other and considering different perspectives and understanding how to communicate to get the direction, the support that I need.
Right.
Yeah, it's sort of it's part of that empowerment, right? Like how do I use my autonomy to advance my own thinking ideas and create more agency for myself, I think.
Yeah.
Um, this next quote, I think is one of my favorites, and it's actually our last. Um, to read it off over here. What constitutes a challenging task versus a task that's just hard? There are many ways in which tasks might be made both challenging and engaging. Dan Mayer argues that it is perplexity, not real life application, that engages students in mathematics. Perplexity is something that piques interest, which makes us want to know more, that it has a bit of both mystery and complexity. Creating cognitive conflict is another way to create the conditions in which students want to learn how to think. In science, challenging tasks require students to use knowledge to explain observable phenomena, reason with observations and data to construct or evaluate explanatory models or theories, and use evidence to develop arguments. How are perplexity and engagement interrelated? How do I find the point of challenge for all my students?
I wrote a quote down because I loved this. It said, "Look for tasks that provoke students to make sense, reason, connect ideas, establish their own ideas, struggle, and get dirty or in the pit with concepts.
Mm.
Hmm.
Good tasks expose misconceptions or underdeveloped ideas and enable discussion that unpack and correct or enhance those ideas."
Hmm.
And I could not help but think of concept mapping
Right,
because that sums it up there, right, in a nutshell. Talk about getting dirty or in the pit. Try concept mapping, you kids.
right, right, right.
But it would expose so much, right? And kids would really get into it. Um, but isn't that when we feel the best? When there is perplexity? Perplexity leads to engagement, I think. And um, when you can really tap into that, that's when things are cooking in your class.
Yeah.
You know, that's when you go home feeling really good
Right.
when that's going on.
Well, I think
And
those kind of, oh, I'm sorry, Judy.
I think, Lori, I love that you brought up concept mapping because I think that that is one of those amazing tools that you can look at as everybody can enter. And I think so often when we think about, I have to create all this stuff so that everybody has something to do at their level. And I know I did this as a teacher, created 1,000 things because I had to differentiate and I had to make sure. And
Mhm.
that was awful as a teacher. And I was absolutely crushing a lot of learning. And, I was sort of making my own decisions about, well, this is where I think they can enter. And concept mapping was always such a beautiful thing because it's, first of all, your entry level might just be, I'm not sure what to do with this. So I'm just going to kind of wait and, you know, maybe listen to a few other students. But there's so many ways to enter that. There's so many ways to grow. And you're all working on the same thing.
Low
But
threshold, high ceiling,
absolutely,
right?
yes, perfect, perfect.
Hmm.
And I think that that's just such an exciting thing because it's brilliant in its simplicity. And I think so many of these things that we talk about, they sound overwhelming and scary until it's when you unpack them, it's like, okay, no, okay, I can do this. This is really, it's hard, but it's not that hard. When
And how
it's,
many times do we say, put the teacher one away?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
It says seek out tasks that create opportunities for different solutions or viewpoints and approaches. And it says one key features is that they require an original response in methods, if not solutions. So,
Mhm.
like, I think about that with concept mapping. Put the teacher, like, you're trying to get what the kids think. You're trying to hear their connections, their thinking. It's not about creating this perfect model.
No, and it's all about handing over that trust and respect because I know for me and for my learning and presenting that so many times is that I realized Oh, I'm really still stuck on that. There is one right answer. And that to me is so empowering for students when it's, well, just because they said that, that is one answer. It doesn't mean, up, I was wrong, figures, guess I'm not going to open my mouth. That excitement of introducing that. There are so many different ways. And I used to love to share with my students, my happy brain when it's like you can say something and it's like, whoa, I never would have thought of that. That's an amazing connection. And that joy that my brain felt, like, does your brain feel really good about, saying something that was really remarkable and that was your own thinking and it was different than your peers thinking and we're both still right.
Or when a kid wants to add a word, can I put this word on the concept map that's not there? Yes. Yes, you can.
Yes. Yeah, like,
Yes, you
whoa.
can.
And again, for a student to be modeling that, that's
Yeah.
not being, nope, 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 let's not mess with that. That, yeah, what a cool thing to model as a teacher. Absolutely, you can. You justified it, so yes, you can.
Mhm.
Well, and I just think of how this stands in such contrast to what we were talking about a little earlier, which is like if you just simplify this last sentence in the paragraph, creating cognitive conflict creates the conditions in which students want to learn. Like if we are removing that and we're shying away from it and we're trying to make things quote unquote efficient by just delivering direct instruction, getting performance in the short term, we're not creating the conditions the kids want to learn in.
Mhm.
They don't want to. They don't want to learn how to learn. They want to learn how to think. They don't want to learn. And then, isn't that a common point of frustration for us as teachers?
Right.
They don't want to think. They don't want to engage. They don't want to learn. Well, what kind of cognitive conflict are your activities, are your lessons creating? And I love this quote on page 159 where they interview, I think it's a sixth grade math teacher. And as a start of my career as a math teacher, a high school math teacher, and one of the things is, um, you always kind of think about this in a math context. He's saying, I feel he's talking about reflecting on word problems. I feel these problems have enough ambiguity to create some interesting thinking opportunities and perhaps some discussion. And then it involves candy bars. So he says the candy bar problem taps into issues of fairness, which early adolescent students are obsessed with, and the basketball problem has an element of figuring out who's best. Would student, for instance, and this is what he's wondering, would students recognize that determining the best is more complicated than a simple average? So by creating ambiguity, seeking out terms that are not really black and white, that there can be lots of different perspectives on it, creates cognitive conflict in these math problems. There's no, we talk like a lot of times talk about like trick questions. It's not a trick question. What's the best? It's really a question of what best means or what fair means. And that is the source of a lot of cognitive conflict. Um, and and
That's when
that,
I enjoyed teaching the most, is when
yeah,
I was
absolutely.
presenting that because of what I would get back from the kids.
Exactly, because it's like Judy shared earlier, it's like, wow, where did you I didn't think about that. Like
Mm.
I I mean, great connection, but like where what made you think of that? And
That's when kids were having the most fun too.
right, but it's
Mm.
also where it's most authentic as well.
Hmm.
And so cognitive conflict is a clear signal to students that this is an authentic opportunity to engage and to learn and to take a risk, which is all the things we're talking about. Again, over supporting, over scaffolding, removing the challenge, all these sort of things removes that cognitive conflict. And in fact, I think for some people, cognitive conflict is just a scary thing to avoid. It feels messy. It feels uncomfortable. Like it feels like a struggle. But the other thing that's also sneaky about this, I think, which is, I don't want to go too far off topic, but I think it's on topic in a lot of ways, is that the more that things like AI are getting involved in teaching and in learning and as tools just in our culture, one of the things that AI is very good at is removing perplexity. It's it's foundationally designed to make things predictable. So, in one sense, it writes sentences and it writes documents predicting what should come next, what is least perplexing. And when I think about that, I worry in terms of when I think about the world that our students are increasingly living in as being more AI generated content and teaching being more AI generated content and so on and so forth, that the tasks and the content and the world that we're wrapped around virtually in text and otherwise is going to become less perplexing. But in fact, it may not be reflective of things that are true, which is something that AI really struggles with. And it was funny, I guess a quick side note, somebody had sent me an email about something the other day, and they said, I was so embarrassed. I was in this meeting, and the person brought up this feature in the product that I didn't know existed. And then I went back to look at, and I felt unprepared in the meeting. And I went back and I looked up all the documentation on the product, and the feature didn't exist. But when I used this AI tool to, we'll call it Google, um, for the feature, it explained to me all how that feature worked. And what had happened was is that the tool had, in the more common term now is called hallucinations. So the tool had made up this
Oh my
feature
gosh.
existing and how to use it and all the documentation on it by knitting together things that made sense from different places on the internet and different sources. But in reality, it didn't exist. But everybody believed it because it wasn't perplexing. It was very straightforward. It seemed very, whatever. And so the connection here is, I think, that just like in today's world and for the last, whatever decades, part of the value of the classroom and bringing people together is to be able to use that opportunity to create authentic learning, to authentic risk taking, social interaction. I think we learned a lot of this through COVID, that learning online was virtually was not the same as being in the same room together. I think one of the things going forward that we have to think about is that our classrooms need to be complex and perplexing places because students are going to be fed a lot of information and live in a world that seems very, very straightforward, but may actually foundationally be very inaccurate, very misleading. And unless they've developed these sort of skills to seek out complexity and to kind of work with perplexing things and to really think about it and to question, I think that they're going to be at a loss. And I think we may be, as teachers and as like public education, giving up a huge point of value in what we bring to our communities, but to these kids.
Yeah. I think, and I think the other really important thing as we wrap up
Yep.
is the what he did with the basketball and the candy bar question. I loved and I loved that whole section because what really jumped out at me that sort of goes along with what you're talking about, Francis, is he got to know so much about his students. Like that was such great formative assessment. And that's so powerful that he was seeing them as human beings, and here's where their brain is. And nothing was good, bad, or indifferent. It was simply, oh, here are some interesting things that I'm seeing, I'm learning how they attacked this particular problem. And all of the things that, the hoops that we used to have to jump through sometimes as teachers to, get to know where should I begin and all those things, we would forget the humanity around. Let me take a look at this as to how they looked at this problem. And I thought that to me was a really powerful thing too, about the way he chose to get to know them and get to know what they were thinking about.
Mm. And
That's what you
Lori,
miss with direct instruction, is you don't get to see what kids are thinking.
and
Precisely. Yes.
and Lori, you've talked about the importance of community building, especially at the beginning of the year, to kind of, you know,
Hmm.
set the culture in motion.
Hmm.
And Judy, how much have those kids learned about each other?
Yeah.
Not only the teacher learning about the kids, but think about the community that's being built as you start to learn how your peers think and what they value. It's huge.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, I think we covered it today. So again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm Francis Vigent and my colleagues Lori Colpoys and Judy Higgins. I hope that everyone listening has enjoyed this discussion. You can get resources, the slideshow, a recording, reflection questions if you'd like to see it again on your own, or if you'd like to have this discussion with your team at knowAtom.com. You can also reach out to us on X or Facebook as well. Thanks for your time and good luck in your journey.